Then today on Capitol Hill, we got this from Senator Dianne Feinstein, the top Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. It says, quote, Special Counsel Mueller's investigation has resulted in 23 indictments, 5 guilty pleas, and 1 prison sentence in only 1 year. Confirming Brian Benczkowski puts that investigation in jeopardy. Quote, Benczkowski refuses to recuse himself from the Russia investigation, despite having worked for a Russian bank under investigation for ties to Trump. He also pushed for Comey's firing with Attorney General Jeff Sessions while serving on the Trump transition team. Those are clear conflicts of interest. All right, what this is about is a controversial Trump administration appointment to a senior post at the Justice Department. We've talked about this nomination a few times here on this show. It is now happening. This is the Trump administration's nominee to run the criminal division at the Justice Department. It's a super important job, super high-profile job. Robert Mueller, who is now the special counsel, he's obviously famous for having previously been director of the FBI. Before he was director of the FBI, he had this job. He led the criminal division at the Justice Department. The current director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, he too, before he got named to run the FBI, he was running the criminal division at the Justice Department. It's a very senior, very important, very hands-on job. You oversee all criminal prosecutions for the U.S. Department of Justice. You oversee hundreds of prosecutors. And those nuts and bolts responsibilities of this very big job, those are part of why the Trump administration's nominee for this job has been an odd choice all along.
And here's the question we asked. Mr. Benczkowski, you are seeking the position of Assistant Attorney General in charge of the criminal division with 600 prosecutors that you will direct. Please tell the committee how many cases you have prosecuted as a lawyer. First, civil cases. The answer? None. Oh, well, how about criminal cases? How many criminal cases have you prosecuted in your lifetime as a lawyer? None. How many motions have you filed before a federal court? None. Wait a minute. You are being chosen to head up the criminal division of the Department of Justice, and you have no experience. You have never prosecuted a case, never once been in a federal courtroom, not one time? That's a fact.
It is an odd thing for the Trump administration to have chosen someone to lead hundreds of prosecutors in the criminal division of the Justice Department when that person has never in their life filed a motion in federal court, let alone tried a case, right? But this particular nominee, in addition to that almost bizarre lack of relevant experience, is also controversial for another very specific reason. Again, his name is Brian Benczkowski. He's a former staffer to Senator Jeff Sessions, before Senator Sessions became Attorney General. Mr. Benczkowski was also part of the Trump transition. When the Trump transition was over, because Trump was getting sworn in and the administration was starting, Brian Benczkowski put in a request that he be considered for a job at the Justice Department. He put in that request, and then he left, and he went back to private practice. Specifically, he went to work for a Russian bank called Alfa Bank, which at the time was trying to clean up its reputation after it appeared prominently in the Christopher Steele dossier about ties between the Trump campaign and Russia, and after computer servers for Alfa Bank were found to have had mysterious electronic communications with Trump Organization computers over a period of several months during the 2016 presidential campaign. Those electronic communications between the servers for Alfa Bank and the Trump Organization during the campaign, those are as yet still unexplained. Brian Benczkowski was hired by Alfa Bank after he worked on the Trump transition in the very early days of the Trump administration to come in and help Alfa Bank clean up its image, to essentially put a U.S. law firm stamp of approval on internal investigations that Alfa Bank commissioned to purportedly clear them of any wrongdoing and any association with the Trump campaign. But the timeline here is kind of astonishing. So this guy Benczkowski is working on the Trump transition. He then tells the Trump administration he wants a Justice Department job. He leaves government service and goes to work on that whitewash effort for the Russian bank, exonerating it from its alleged role in helping the Trump campaign collude with Russia in a couple of reports that were not exactly exonerating, but they said they were. And then, bingo, immediately after he helped Russian Alpha Bank with their whitewash job, there was no collusion here. We weren't part of any funny business between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Immediately after he works directly and personally on that whitewash effort, he does in fact get a job offer from the Trump administration. And it's not like they offered him a U.S. attorney job somewhere. They offered him a really, really, really big job. They offered him to run the criminal division at the Justice Department. If he is actually confirmed to run the criminal division at the Justice Department, among other things, that will put Brian Benczkowski in the line of succession to oversee the Mueller investigation if Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein ever gets fired or quits. Today, all Republicans in the Senate and conservative Democratic Senator Joe Manchin voted to clear the way for Brian Benczkowski to be confirmed to that job tomorrow. All Democrats except Joe Manchin voted no. All Republicans voted yes. That Brian Benczkowski vote, we expect, will be tomorrow. Scott Schools is the top career official at the Justice Department. You do a Getty image search for Scott Schools. This is the only result. And that, of course, is not Scott Schools. That is Sean Spicer, who was President Trump's first press secretary. The reason it comes up for Scott Schools is that that piece of paper Sean Spicer is waving around in his hand in that picture, that piece of paper is a letter written by Scott Schools. You can zoom in and see his curly signature on the bottom of that letter. Scott Schools has a super important job, but clearly not a high-profile one, given that this is what you get when you go looking for news photos of him. He is the top career official at the Justice Department. That's him in the middle there. Thank you, Google image search. You know, political appointees are one thing. They come and go with each administration, but career officials stay. And Scott Schools is the senior one at the Justice Department. And although he does have a really senior job, it's a very strictly behind-the-scenes kind of role. One of his former colleagues called him, quote, the most important unknown person in D.C., which became the headline of the most important and influential profile of Scott Schools ever written. Scott Schools is one of the only people at the Justice Department to receive regular briefings on the status of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's work. This picture, in fact, is him leaving Robert Mueller's offices a few weeks ago. When then Acting Attorney General Sally Yates was looking for guidance from the Justice Department ahead of her congressional testimony about her being fired, she went to Scott Schools for that advice. When the department sent instructions to Justice Department employees that they needed to save records and documents to turn over to the special counsel, particularly related to the firing of FBI Director James Comey, that request for preserving documents, that request came from Scott Schools. When acting Deputy AG Dana Bente had to let the higher-ups at the department know he was being called as a witness in the special counsel's investigation, that notice went straight to Scott Schools. Look at the handwritten notes in some of these documents. Took notes to Scott Schools. Provided to Scott Schools. Scott Schools, Scott Schools, Scott Schools. For the past year and a half, Scott Schools has been kind of seen as kind of a guardrail at the Justice Department, protecting investigations and the work that the investigators do, try to protect them from the chaos that has been rattling around the DOJ since Donald Trump became president, providing a sort of rudder for his colleagues in terms of the right thing to do ethically, the right thing to do in terms of sticking to the rule of law and sticking to Justice Department process and procedure. Scott Schools' colleagues describe him as a kind of security blanket, sort of emotional snuggie to keep everybody calm and carrying on and doing things by the book. Today, Scott Schools quit. NPR broke the news today that Mr. Schools is leaving the Justice Department. His last day is Friday this week. NPR reports he isn't being pushed out. He's not leaving because of a dispute with leadership. He will be replaced, apparently, by another career lawyer at the Justice Department. But for whatever reason, the Justice Department is losing its Yoda at a time when the Justice Department is under a sustained, pointed, aggressive, partisan attack from the President of the United States and Republican members of Congress. So now what happens? Joining us now is Leon Neyfakh, who is a staff writer for Slate. He wrote that aforementioned profile of Scott Schools last year, which was headlined, "The Most Important Unknown Person in D.C. As the Russia investigation deepens, Scott Schools has become the conscience of the Justice Department." Mr. Nayfack, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I say that this is the most influential and important profile of Scott Schools because it's the one that has, because you figured out who he was and what he was doing.
It's the only one.
Yeah, but you win. What's your reaction to him leaving, and has anything evolved since you wrote this last summer?
Has anything happened since then?
Yeah, in terms of understanding his role.
Well, I was surprised. I would assume that he came to this job in October of 2016 thinking he would stay in it for many, many years. His predecessor, David Margolis, was in the job for over 20 years. And I suspect that Scott Schools, who was sort of being groomed to replace Margolis for many years, probably thought that he had a similar future. He obviously didn't know that President Trump would be elected. Maybe he thought it would be a different job. As you said, the reports today said that there was no sort of instigating dispute, that there was no kind of duress that led to his exit. Seems like he just got another opportunity. But maybe another opportunity just looks like an opportunity when you hate your job. I don't know.
So he was an associate deputy attorney general, and
Yes.
there are a number of people who have that job.
Yes.
He is described, though, as the senior career official at the Justice Department, and as being, as you wrote about, sort of the person who basically tells people what to do when they're up against it, when they're in a difficult or unprecedented or highly pressured situation with regard to the Justice Department, the rule of law, policies and procedures of the department. What exactly was his job? What kinds of disputes would go to him?
So basically, the thorniest, most sensitive situations go to his desk. If Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, needs to decide whether to appoint a special counsel, let's say, he would ask Scott Schools for advice. If he were trying to decide who to appoint to that job, he would probably ask Scott Schools for advice. When Rod Rosenstein goes to testify to Congress, he probably talks to Scott Schools about what he can say, what he can't say. Schools' predecessor, who I mentioned before, David Margolis, he was sort of seen as a fixer in the department. He was someone that you could trust to have the institutional memory, to know how to deal with weird situations where there were political complications, where there were sort of issues of self-governance within the agency. And he was given all the sort of most all the hottest potatoes. One a good example is that he was, in the room when the decision was made not to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Years earlier, he was the one who was sent to the office of Vince Foster, the Deputy White House Counsel, after Vince Foster committed suicide. The most sensitive situations are the ones that the person in this job gets.
And now this person has left with no explanation.
That's right.
I'm unnerved. Mr. Leon Nayfack, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. All right. Much more to come on what has turned out to be a very busy holiday eve, including some news that we are getting in from overseas that you definitely don't know about yet, but has big domestic implications. That's coming up. Stay with us. Today, I pretty much thought we would learn that the president is finally admitting paying off an adult film star right before the election so she wouldn't talk about her alleged affair with him. I thought we'd learn that today, that the president was admitting it. I definitely did not think that admission from the president would also be immediately and formally referred to the United States Department of Justice because it may relate to an ongoing investigation. But here's the referral. Quote, Office of Government Ethics has determined that the information provided in this declaration meets the disclosure requirements for a reportable liability. I am providing both reports to you because you may find the disclosure relevant to any inquiry you may be pursuing regarding the president's prior financial disclosure report that was signed in June of last year. Sincerely, David Apal, Acting Director of the United States Office of Government Ethics. Joining us now is Adav Noti. He's a Senior Director of Trial Litigation at the Campaign Legal Center. Mr. Noti, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
What's your understanding of this? I'm calling it a referral. I'm not actually even sure if that's the right way to describe it. This letter from the head of the Office of Government Ethics to the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. What exactly is this, and how important is it?
It's very important. It is, for all intents and purposes, a criminal referral. The Office of Government Ethics looked at the nature of the liability that the president disclosed today. They looked at when it was incurred, when it was paid, and what it was for. and determined that it should have been, based on those facts, reported on last year's personal financial disclosure, and so they notify the Department of Justice of that fact, because intentionally omitting information from a personal disclosure report is a violation of federal law.
A violation of how big a federal law? Is this a sort of technical foul, the sort of thing where you apologize and promise not to do it again, or is this the sort of thing that sometimes gets prosecuted?
Well, it really depends on the state of mind with which it's done. If it's inadvertent, nobody is going to be criminally prosecuted. But it is a crime, a criminal offense, to omit something from a personal financial disclosure report knowingly and willfully. And, I think there are facts out there that we know about how the repayment to Mr. Cohen was structured, how it was funneled, to use Mr. Giuliani's term, to Mr. Cohen through a law firm, that indicate that there was some potential intent to deceive.
The disclosure from the president today in his financial disclosure form is a little bit unusual. It's 40-something pages into the declaration. It happens in a footnote, and basically in the footnote, while making the declaration, the president asserts that he doesn't really need to be making this disclosure, that it's just in the name of transparency that he's putting this out there. The Office of Government Ethics seems to be saying that the president is wrong there, that the president didn't have a choice about whether or not to disclose this, that he was required to, and in fact he was required to not this year, but last year. How unusual is that for the Office of Government Ethics to be materially disputing something in the disclosure that they're releasing to the public?
The entire thing is extremely unusual. The back and forth where the president inserts that footnote and says, I'm not required to tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. And the Office of Government Ethics says, well, actually, no, you were required. None of that is usual. But what matters is that the president doesn't get to decide what he should or shouldn't report. The Office of Government Ethics does, and they determined that he should have reported this debt last year.
Adav Noti, Senior Director of Trial Litigation at the Campaign Legal Center. I really appreciate your time tonight, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Again, the intriguing part here is, for me, is when the Office of Government Ethics sends this to Rod Rosenstein and says, this may be relevant to any inquiry you may be pursuing regarding the president's financial disclosure last year. Is the Justice Department already pursuing an inquiry into the president's financial disclosures last year? If they are, we didn't know that. I don't know if the Office of Government Ethics knows something that we don't, but if so, I guess this goes in the file. Remarkable news day today. We'll be right back. More to get to. Continuing to cover the stunning breaking news this evening, first broken by CNN, now confirmed by NBC News, that Michael Cohen, the longtime attorney for President Donald Trump, claims that President Trump, then as a candidate, knew in advance of the Trump Tower meeting that was held in the summer of 2016, June 2016, in which emissaries from the Russian government offered to meet with senior members of the Trump campaign in order to deliver to them what they described as Russian government dirt on Hillary Clinton. It was described overtly in emails setting up that meeting as an effort by the Russian government to help Donald Trump in his election effort against Hillary Clinton. Michael Cohen is reportedly prepared to tell Robert Mueller, the special counsel, that Trump knew of and approved of the Trump Tower meeting before it happened. Cohen is apparently, again, willing to tell the special counsel that he's alleging, according to this reporting tonight, that Mr. Cohen alleges that he was present along with several other people when Donald Trump Sr. was informed about this offer of the meeting. He was informed of that by Donald Trump Jr. And by Mr. Cohen's account, Donald Trump Sr. heard the pitch, basically, and overtly approved going ahead with that meeting with the Russians. I have questions about the implications of this revelation tonight. Joining us now is Chuck Rosenberg. He's a former U.S. attorney, former senior official at the FBI and the Justice Department. Mr. Rosenberg, thank you for joining us on Zero Notice. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rachel.
You've heard my efforts to sum this up. Let me just ask your first reaction to the importance of this report tonight.
Extraordinarily important, but at the same time, not terribly surprising.
In terms of the legal liability for the president here, putting aside the question of how this came to light, just taking it at blunt force face value, if the president knew overtly, if he was advised in front of other people, that this was the Russian government offering negative information on his opponent in order to help him in the election, he weighed that, approved taking the meeting and accepting the information. Directly on that matter, are there legal implications for that?
Absolutely. And so a really important question here, Rachel, is, did he know the Russians were coming? Did he know they were coming with dirt? And if he knew they were coming with dirt, did he know where they got it from, right? So the answer to each of those questions would probably open up a different theory of liability. If he knew that they were Russians coming with dirt that they had stolen from hacked computers, that means he might have joined their conspiracy if he simply covered up the fact afterwards. Maybe he's an accessory after the fact. So all of these things are highly fact-dependent on, and I hate to be so cliched, what he knew and when he knew it.
In terms of, and you put emphasis there on whether the president was advised or learned that the supposed dirt on Hillary Clinton was obtained by illegal means, whether it was stolen or hacked information. What if that wasn't part of the equation? What if the president was advised that the Russian government had dirt on Hillary Clinton, full stop, he didn't know where it came from? Would that change the circumstance under which there might be liability here?
It might, but I can think of another theory. Prosecutors tend to be pretty creative. I recall that the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and said his father had absolutely no knowledge of the meeting before it happened. Well, let's say that turns out not to be true. Did his father counsel his son to lie? Did they conspire for the son to commit perjury or obstruct justice? So prosecutors are quite creative, and they're going to have a lot of facts to work with here.
Chuck, I also want to ask you about how we came to know this information. We got a statement tonight from Lanny Davis, who is a lawyer for Michael Cohen, who told us, I have to wonder why the Trump people would put that out. It was not from us. That's Mr. Davis's statement. You take it for what it's worth. If he's right, and this was the Trump people, the Trump side, Mr. Trump's lawyers putting this out, presumably because they want to get ahead of this story. Obviously, the story doesn't look good for the president, so they'd want to get out ahead of this. There's been a lot of discussion tonight already as to whether or not the president's lawyers might have done that in part to undermine the ability of Mr. Cohen to provide this information to prosecutors in a way that might be of benefit to Mr. Cohen in negotiation with them in terms of his own legal liability, but also so that they could use it for their ongoing investigations and any other related investigations. What do you make of that, of those factors?
So a couple of thoughts. Let's assume for the purposes of my answer, Rachel, that Mr. Cohen is cooperating. They've made the decision that he is going to tell prosecutors what he knows, and he's going to do that honestly. We used to call that, joining Team America. He's signed up. He's on the team. If that's true, there is no way in the world that Mr. Cohen would leak this information. It just doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, I don't really think the leak, if it came from the Trump team, undermines Cohen's value as a witness. Here's why. The government still needs to prove it. They still need to have somebody who can get on the stand and testify to it. They need to corroborate it. And so the fact that it's already out there is not good for the government because they don't want details of their investigation made public before they choose to make it public. But they still need Mr. Cohen as a witness. Somebody has to put meat on that bone. And an anonymous leak from an unknown source, that's not going to cut it from a prosecutorial standpoint. That's information, but it's not evidence, at least not in a technical sense. And so if they're trying to undermine Mr. Cohen's value as a witness, I think that fails.
You say, that's a crucial point, and thank you for making it and being so clear about it, Chuck. But you mentioned there's part of making that point that, of course, this isn't good for prosecutors. This isn't good for the government because it means that a potentially important part of their investigation is now out in public. If this was made public after being obtained by the president's lawyers during that process of that special master sorting out all the evidence that was seized from Michael Cohen under a legally executed search warrant in April, it's my guess that that might be where the president's lawyers got this information, if that is, in fact, where this information has come from tonight. It would seem to me that that's also where the president's lawyers may have obtained the tape or the transcript of the tape that was released earlier this week to such fanfare in terms of the president talking about that payment to Karen McDougal, if they're taking evidence from that process as the special master is going through stuff, all this stuff that was seized by the FBI, if they're taking that evidence and putting it out in the public domain, does Michael Cohen or does anybody have a way to stop that? Is that illegal or improper for the president's lawyers to be doing that with evidence seized in that way?
Again, possibly, and I hate to give you so many possiblities, Rachel, but if this information was under a protective order or a gag order issued by the court, then anybody who leaks it could be violating that order. That could be a contempt of court. Can Michael Cohen enforce that? Probably not. In fact, off the top of my head, I can't think of a way that he could enforce it. But the government can enforce it, and they can do it by charging people with a whole variety of crimes, from the ones you and I have already discussed to possibly obstruction of justice. If they can show that the reason for these leaks were to hinder the investigation, undermine the prosecution, or try, and again, I think it would only be a try, not a success, try to undermine the value of Michael Cohen as a witness. Look, if he really knows this stuff, Rachel, he's a valuable witness. And leaking the information is not ideal from a prosecutor's standpoint because they don't want it made public, but they're still going to need Mr. Cohen.
Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney, former senior FBI and Justice Department official, ringing clear as a bell tonight. Chuck, thank you very, very much. That was super helpful. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Joining us now for the interview is someone I would very much like you to meet. He's someone with a great deal of high-level experience in a place that is basically news central for us these days. His name is David Laufman. David Laufman served in the Department of Justice under Republican and Democratic administrations. Before he stepped down from the Justice Department in February of this year, Mr. Laufman served in the National Security Division at DOJ. He was the chief of the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section in the National Security Division. Now, in that capacity, he oversaw investigations you might have heard of, like the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And before Special Counsel Robert Mueller was appointed, he helped to oversee the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. This is Mr. Laufman's first television interview since leaving the Justice Department. David Laufman, thank you very much for making the trip here, and thanks for being willing to come on the show. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
First of all, let me ask you the circumstances under which you left the Justice Department. You left in February of this year.
Yes, I left on my own steam. I had 3 eventful years, about 25 years altogether public service, a lot of it at the department. I felt like I had contributed in any way I could, and it was simply time to move on to a new chapter of my career.
In terms of being willing to talk publicly about your experiences and what's going on in the news right now, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because we rarely have the chance to talk with people who are recently serving high-ranking officials who may be able to give us some insight into how these things that we see in the news really affect the day-to-day work of people who are doing the kind of work that you did on behalf of the country. The Washington Post tonight is breaking yet another story. The president has privately revived the idea of firing Attorney General Jeff Sessions this month. At least twice in the past month, he's vented to White House advisors and his lawyers about the, quote, endless investigation of his campaign. He says he needs to fire the Attorney General for saddling his presidency with the controversy. We all watch that, and we know that's unusual as citizens. Within the Justice Department, how does this unusual pressure from the president feel? How does it affect the work of the department?
Look, you've got tens of thousands of professionals, men and women, working every day on behalf of their country, doing their best to conduct fair-minded, impartial, professional law enforcement investigations. In my case, in the national security realm, they're putting their nose to the grindstone. They're doing what they can to adduce admissible evidence under the rule of law and propel investigations forward in this carnival-like atmosphere that absorbs the rest of us in our daily jobs, daily lives, is really not impacting them that much. They're really focused on the mission at hand. They're very mission-focused, and that's what's guiding them, I think, through this circumstance. As far as the Attorney General goes, that's a horse of a different color.
Political appointee.
I mean, look, the president is entitled to a cabinet of his choice, men and women he can work with to carry out his agenda. But I can't think of any policy area of the president's agenda that Attorney General Sessions is not ardently carrying out. So there's only one reason, when you think about it, for why the president would want to get rid of Jeff Sessions, and that's to install somebody in his place who would circumscribe or undermine the work of the special counsel's office. And that is just a reprehensible prospect for the health of our criminal justice system and our domestic polity.
That would it work if the president decided to take that approach? I mean, let's say that the Republican-led Senate could be persuaded to confirm somebody else without getting any promises from them about how they would treat or respect the special counsel's office or not. If that was the president's plan, to ice the AG so that the new AG would not be recused and would be overseeing Mueller and would undermine the probe, would it be an effective tactic?
We won't know until we know, will we? It will come down to the integrity and character of the individual who's installed in that position. In that moment of truth, where he or she is faced with having to make a decision at the behest of the president that has some material adverse impact on the fulfillment of an ongoing investigation, then we'll know. And we'll hope that that person has the steel in the spine to make the right decision.
You said that the career law enforcement professionals at the Justice Department, particularly working on national security stuff, people have keeping their nose to the grindstone. They've got work to do. They're going to keep doing this. They don't let this stuff affect them. We have seen the careers of a number of senior people taken apart by political criticism and pressure. And it's all the circumstances have been slightly different, and all of the scandals have been bigger or smaller depending on the individual. But we've seen the counterintelligence chief agent at the FBI, Peter Strzok. We've seen Lisa Page, who was counsel to the deputy director. We've seen the FBI director himself. Today, Justice Department official Bruce Orr, who's a long history on international and Russian organized crime, among other things, is being pilloried. It does seem like people who might be otherwise keeping their nose to the grindstone also have to be worried that they'll get the crosshairs trained on them shortly.
An understandable concern. Look, each one of these cases you mentioned has its own gestalt, specific facts and circumstances in each of those cases. I don't have visibility into all those details, but you're raising a larger important concern, which is whether the Department of Justice has a big bullseye on its back, and more broadly, whether the denigration, the constant repeated denigration of the Department of Justice and its leadership and the types of officials you've described is part of an effort to undermine the integrity and independence of one of the most important institutions in our government. And that's incredibly worrisome.
And is there a fix for that?
The fix for it is to raise the costs to carrying out those kinds of actions by raising the cost to the people who could lend their voices now to expressing objections to the types of courses of action that we hear about in the offing, where Republican members of Congress who control both houses, unless they're retiring and suddenly feel a spurt of loquaciousness and willingness to speak their mind, would suddenly start holding accountable those officials, including the president, who, if they're exercising their legal authority, may be stepping close to the edge of overstepping their legal authority or abusing their legal authority, whether it's putting pressure on the department to curtail ongoing legitimate investigations or threatening the pardon of individuals for apparently partisan reasons. All those things should be something that puts the country's collective hair on fire. And we count on our elected officials to be a bulwark against that kind of abuse of power. And they are failing in that task today.
Our guest is David Loffman, who is a senior official at the Department of Justice, specifically the National Security Division. He was the chief of counterintelligence and in the export control section. I will be right back with Mr. Loffman right after this. Stay with us. Back with us again for the interview tonight is David Loffman. Until this February, he served in the National Security Division at the Justice Department. He was chief at the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section. As such, he oversaw a number of very high-profile investigations, including the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and before the special counsel was appointed, the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Mr. Loffman, thank you for staying with us. And I know that a lot of these matters that are ongoing investigations still are things that you can't comment on in terms of your role in them when they were open. But I want to ask you about something that I think you were basically in charge of at Justice Department until February, which is FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act. Enforcement. This is something that we're about to see the president's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, go on trial for in his second federal trial in D.C. It has come up in a number of the other prosecutions and guilty pleas that have been brought about people against people surrounding the president. The question I have about this is that I understand what the law is. That you have to register as a foreign agent if you're acting on behalf of a foreign government. But it seems to me like this was never prosecuted before. or very rarely prosecuted before. And now all of a sudden there's this flurry of prosecutions around this issue when it comes to the Trump-Russia scandal. What do you make of that?
Well, it's true that there's only been a handful of criminal prosecutions over the last several years. There's reasons why it's hard to charge a criminal violation of FARA. Some of these are technical, turgid, in the weeds FARA stuff, but you've got to be able to produce admissible evidence that there was direction and control of the agent of a foreign principal by the foreign principal. There's challenges in proving willfulness, which is an element of a criminal offense. So there are some structural challenges to proving these cases. I can't speak for why in decades before I arrived on the scene, there was only a handful of investigations. What I can tell you is that when I arrived in late 2014, we did an assessment of whether we were firing on all cylinders with respect to propelling forward investigations of all the areas of our responsibility, whether they be espionage, export control or sanctions, theft of trade secrets, or investigations and prosecutions of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which was another part of the mosaic of the national security mission of the Department of Justice. And so we endeavored to make sure that we were, in as muscular but appropriate a fashion as possible, investigating and holding accountable parties that had an obligation to register and willfully failed to do so. So I think the Manafort case that is going to go to trial in September ought to be seen in that larger context. And the enforcement of FARA is really part of the broader picture of how the department approaches foreign influence operations in the United States today writ large, whether it's malign cyber operations or more espionage-like activities like the Maria Butina case in D.C. or straight-up FARA prosecutions.
David Loftman, I appreciate that this is the first TV interview you've done since leaving the Justice Department earlier this year. I hope that you'll come back. I feel like your expertise is something that is really unique, and it's helpful to hear from you. Thank you for being here.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for your service.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
We'll be back. Stay with us. By now, I'm sure you've seen the 3-inch tall, 5-column wide banner headlines in every newspaper across the country. U.S. President acknowledges previously secret 6-figure payment to adult film actress. Stop presses. That, in fact, did get acknowledged today by the serving president of the United States. A headline like that, or anything even remotely like it, would be enough to sink any other presidency in the history of the Republic. But in this presidency, it barely breaks the top 10 of scandals for today. The president has previously denied any knowledge of the supposed affair with adult film actress Stormy Daniels. He's also specifically denied knowledge of any payment to her, but he is now admitting in black and white. It's acknowledged a little awkwardly, 40-something pages into the president's new financial disclosure form in a footnote. Because the payment to this adult film actress and her allegations about an affair with the president, because it's been a sort of slow boil scandal, we all knew to look for this financial disclosure, to maybe expect it in this form when it came out today. But when this disclosure arrived today, it did come with a surprise in the form of this letter to the Honorable Rod Rosenstein, Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Quote, "Dear Mr. Rosenstein, I write to you in connection with the complaint by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington on March 8, 2018, with the Department of Justice and with the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. Specifically, the complaint requested that DOJ and the Office of Government Ethics investigate whether a payment made by Mr. Michael Cohen to a third party constituted a loan to the president that should have been reported as a liability on his disclosure report, the one that was signed in June 2017. If so, whether the failure to report it was knowing and willful. Today, I certified President Trump's financial disclosure report signed on May 15, 2018. The Office of Government Ethics has concluded that based on the information provided as a note to Part 8, that would be the aforementioned footnote, the payment made by Mr. Cohen is required to be reported. OGE has determined that the information provided in that note meets the disclosure requirements for a reportable liability under the Ethics in Government Act. Now, here's the nut. I am providing both reports to you because you may find the disclosure relevant to any inquiry you may be pursuing regarding the president's prior report that was signed on June 14th, 2017. And it signed Director David J. Apal, Acting Director of the United States Office of Government Ethics. The president had to disclose today that he made that payment to the adult film actress, the one he did not disclose last year, but he is disclosing it now. Alongside that disclosure, the Office of Government Ethics is referring that disclosure to the Justice Department. You may find the disclosure relevant to any inquiry you may be pursuing. Why are they notifying the Justice Department of that and in that way? There's an answer to that, and I think we might be able to get to it right here next. As we all remember quite acutely, just 11 days before the presidential election in 2016, FBI Director James Comey sent a note to Congress saying, hey, he was reopening the Hillary Clinton FBI investigation. That letter more or less blew up the presidential race. The Hillary Clinton campaign believes that was like a comet flying down from the heavens and smashing into their campaign. Last night, I asked Director Comey about something that happened right before he sent that note to Congress. When Rudy Giuliani, at that time a top advisor to the Trump campaign, he got on Fox News and he said some surprises were coming that would really turn the race around in Trump's favor. That was 2 days before James Comey, in fact, announced the reopening of the Clinton investigation. After Comey made that announcement, Giuliani went back on TV and basically said, yeah, that was what he'd been hinting at. He'd had advance notice from FBI agents that the investigation was going to get reopened. Did Rudy Giuliani and therefore the Trump campaign have advance notice from inside the FBI, from the New York field office or wherever, that this announcement from you was coming?
Not that I know of, but I saw that same publicity, and so I commissioned an investigation to see if we could understand whether people were disclosing information out of the New York office or any other place that resulted in Rudy's report on Fox News and other leaks that we were seeing in the media. I don't know what the result of that was. I got fired before it was finished, but I know I asked that it be investigated.
That answer from James Comey here last night has gotten a good bit of attention in the wake of that interview. Mr. Comey telling us that Rudy Giuliani's comments during the campaign prompted him, Comey, to order an FBI investigation into whether people inside the FBI were feeding the Trump campaign non-public information about the Clinton investigation during the campaign. James Comey confirming to us last night that he ordered an investigation into that, but he said he doesn't know what the result was of that investigation he ordered because, of course, he soon got fired. Well, we're not 100% sure what happened to that investigation, but we think that what probably happened to it is that we think it got rolled into a broader investigation by the Justice Department Inspector General, an Inspector General investigation into the FBI and its activities related to the 2016 election. We think that leak issue is part of what the Inspector General is due to report on very soon. Mark Hosenball at Reuters reported yesterday that that Inspector General report will be issued next month, which means we may be about to get the results of the investigation James Comey talked about so intriguingly last night, including the part about Rudy Giuliani, right as Rudy Giuliani is becoming the president's new lawyer on the Russia case. Joining us now is Congressman Eric Swalwell, who's a member of both the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee. Congressman, it's nice to see you this evening. Thanks for being with us.
You too, Rachel. Thanks for having me back.
So the Justice Department Inspector General, we believe, is still doing an investigation, broadly speaking, into the FBI's various activities related to the 2016 campaign. We surmise that that might involve a look at whether or not FBI agents were leaking non-public information to the Trump campaign during the campaign. Do you think that the Inspector General is a credible investigator? Are you, do you think these will be determinative results?
I worry about that, Rachel, because what we've seen as recently as today is now perhaps former Director Comey himself is under investigation by the Director General because of what looks like Republicans seeking the memos that he wrote, leaks that came out about those memos immediately yesterday, and now a report today that he may be under investigation. And of course, we see a president who wants to direct the FBI and the Attorney General as to who he believes they should investigate. So I do fear that the Inspector General could be untowardly influenced by what they're doing. But I'd like to see that report as soon as possible. What is suggested to me is that there were a number of people on the Trump campaign who had foreknowledge about hacks that were occurring against Hillary Clinton, whether it was Roger Stone, then, of course, what was being reported out by Julian Assange, and then, of course, Rudy Giuliani intimating in Fox News appearances that there was an investigation that was about to be reopened. And so it certainly looked like the fix was in from all sorts of angles throughout that late fall of the 2016 campaign.
If something like that was going on during the campaign and Rudy Giuliani was a recipient of that kind of information from inside the FBI and was using it for the Trump campaign's benefit, does that pose an issue for him becoming a leading member of the president's legal team?
Certainly, Rachel. Again, he would be just another individual who, it looks like was, communicating with the Trump campaign during right before the election and passing along perhaps illicitly obtained information. This is an area that we tried to explore in our investigation. Unfortunately, the Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee showed no interest in being willing to subpoena the documents, the communication logs, the travel logs, the bank records for situations like this that we believed occurred because of what we saw in press reporting and from other credible individuals. So hopefully Bob Mueller will tell us, and hopefully with this new DNC lawsuit, we may be able to find out. And remember, Bob Mueller can only tell us what he can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. This DNC lawsuit will be quite illuminating because they don't have the same standard of proof. It's much lower in a civil lawsuit, so what we may learn through a deposition may tell us a lot more about what was going on at the peak of the campaign.
And Congressman, if you heard the top of the show, I'm fascinated by that DNC lawsuit just as a tactic, also by its historical echoes in terms of the DNC having done that during Watergate and it actually having worked, even though people forgot about it at the time. One of the things that was reported about this Democratic Party lawsuit today is that a lot of Democratic elected officials and serving members of Congress were just as blindsided as the Republicans were, and as the Trump campaign was, that this was coming, that this is not something that a lot of people knew was in the works before it was sort of sprung on everybody today when it was filed. Did you have advance notice that this lawsuit was coming? Did you work on it in any way?
No, I did not. And actually, I'm okay with that because that suggests to me that it's a serious lawsuit. It's not something just to really drum up, political talking points. It was something that, lawyers put together looking at the evidence, not asking for other politicians to weigh in. And so there should be a separation between what we're doing in Congress and what happened to the victim in this case, the Democratic National Committee.
Congressman Eric Swalwell of California, thank you very much for being here, sir. It's nice to see you. Thanks a lot. All right, we just got a little bit of breaking news that I've seen the headline for, but I have not absorbed it yet. I'm going to make sure I know what I'm talking about before I tell it to you, and I will do that right after the commercial. Thank you, commercial.